Hey Sukan, have you played Warhammer 40k? Boltgun?
Yeah, man, let me tell you about it.
Sidonus laid down his life for this planet. I protect his sacrifice.
Warhammer 40k, Boltgun. The premise here is that basically your job is to investigate, and that's big air quotes, a fragment of theoretical power source that's been tainted by the energies of chaos. The game opens up with a low animation but really charming looking cutscene explaining how you're basically short-staffed and underprepared, but it's fine. You're fine. This is what you do. You're a space marine. What it doesn't outright say is that you're playing as an Ultramarine, which is Warhammer 40k's version of the Duke Nukem faction. And that counts in multiple ways, actually. We'll double back on that, but they're the action heroes. It's a perfect fit for the type of game this is, and how it's also a spiritual successor to the Warhammer 40k game titled Space Marine, also an Ultramarine. The game itself feels, however, like a successor to Fire Warrior. Anyway, moving on. Let's get into the mechanical aspects and talk about how the game functions first. Movement is very inertia focused and momentum carried, as in there are some mechanics that you can use to gain velocity here. There's a dash that you can jump out of to really slingshot yourself forward, and chainsword dashing really closes the gap between you and an enemy. There's no auto run, but that, in a way, enhances the movement. Walking has a very predictable start-stop pattern. The run, though, really ramps up the speed, but adds a bit of a glide to the movement. You can even bounce off of walls, it's great. This, in a way, the calculated walk and the heavy run does a great job to display the weight of the Space Marine's armor. You're bulky, and you can feel that as you're moving. It's a nice touch to be able to put this feeling into the movement of a boomer shooter and have it add to the experience rather than take away from it. That couldn't have been an easy balance. The jumping, on the other hand, is mechanically important, but there's no scale to the effort put in. A light tap is equal to holding the spacebar. You jump at the same height, and you're committed to that jump, as the air controls are very heavy. The uncontrollable nature of the jump height does have it feel more like you're just popping into the air sometimes, and this can get to feeling a little disconnected to the movement. It's a small gripe, though. To add to the jumping mechanic is a decent mantling system. Hitting a ledge around chest level will have you grab the edge of it and just pull yourself up onto it. Now, moving on to the chainsword. The chainsword here isn't simply a weapon, it is a movement mechanic as well. Attacking with the chainsword directly translates into a forward lunge. If you slip off of an edge, you can lunge at an enemy to regain your composure, or even use it to cross gaps or reach higher platforms in the right circumstances. Initiating a chainsword attack can slow down time and give you a bit to acquire your target if you hold down the button and there's an enemy in range. More importantly, though, there's iframes causing you to close the gap, taking no damage. You can pass directly through projectiles, but it's only for the lunge, not the attack itself. It doesn't reliably stun your target either, so it does offer some risk and reward. There are some more mechanics to the chainsword that we will cover later. The introduction to Boltgun is very on the nose, with not only one but two level layout references actually displaying a recreation of the first area you see in both Doom 1 and Doom 2, just in reverse order. This isn't the first thing you see, no, but it is front-loaded into the first level and conveniently after receiving your first firearm, the bolter or bolt gun. The first level alone is what you'd expect out of 2 or maybe even 3 of the first levels of many older FPSs. It has a small, quaint introduction for you to get familiarized with the controls and what it's like to encounter enemies, followed by a gentle nudge towards how geometry is going to be used, and then an introduction to combat, pickups, secrets, etc. Lastly, it asks you to use what you've learned so far. The first level is pretty peachy. So the question here is, how does this all get used? And, well, you have very linear levels to begin with. Anything off the beaten path is often a secret. I found myself enjoying climbing around on things to a point, but your movement options can be used in so many ways to gain advantages on your enemies. Later on, you'll see levels that wrap around and make use of the same areas multiple times. You're not likely to get lost or anything, But you will revisit areas you've already been in with a key to a door you haven't opened yet and new enemies populating the previously cleared area. In this way, you get more time to appreciate the architecture of the levels and feel like you're actually working to open up an area to get through. This is a classic boomer shooter level design technique. It's just reserved for after you're familiar with the game as a whole. There are no hit scans, bullets have travel time. In fact, every attack in the game can be avoided in one way or another, and on harder difficulties you may just have to choose the lesser of multiple evils. This isn't a simple act of balancing either. It really helps to encourage the player to take each death as a lesson on how to better approach or react to the situation that killed them. When every death feels like it's your own fault, it's much easier to identify what you could do better next time, and this leads to understanding the mechanics better, or as some would say, to get good. The abilities on display here by Malum are a nearly useless forward dash, and I say nearly because you can launch yourself forward by jumping out of it. I rarely did. And the ability called No Fear, which gives a temporary invulnerability upon taking lethal damage, which is recharged through purging the heresy. This is an ability that'll let you cheese bosses if used correctly. Hell, if you really pay attention to this ability alone, it caters to well-timed attacks and retreats with a risk versus reward system that can and will dynamically change the difficulty of any encounter. Many games, especially in the late 90s and early 2000s, would hide a mechanic that gave players a slight advantage when coming closer to a fail state. In shooters, this would sometimes mean taking less damage when below a certain threshold of health. This design was to get the most mileage out of those close call type moments and really amp up the action movie feeling. Here though, in Boltgun, the entire idea was turned into a mechanic that is not only overt and obvious about it, but entirely abusable. This kind of makes you feel like you've always got an ace up your sleeve, which is the best time to shit talk. The good news is that you can just pointlessly taunt your enemies. Okay, taunting isn't entirely useless, even if it might as well be, but it is satisfying because talking shit is one thing Space Marines are good at. The only thing it functionally does is catch the attention and activate some, and only some, of the enemies that are otherwise waiting to ambush. But look, Malum Kaido, the main character, is an Ultramarine. They talk shit all the time. The good news is that you'll only hear the protagonist as much as you want to, since it's a simple button press to drop one-liners either at an enemy or in general. I would like to take this time to point out that Kaido here is voiced by Rahul Kohli, a very good actor for just hamming up a role, and he's really nailing it in the line delivery here. There's an energy to the cold way a Space Marine views heresy and the thorough faith that they put in the Emperor that you expect them to speak with a righteous conviction. And yeah, this is exactly how I think of them talking. Props for casting this guy into the role.
I will finish the work Captain Titus started. You die here, Bernie.
So on to the power-ups. There are power-ups that offer to boost the weapon that you're holding when you pick it up for the rest of the map that you're on. Or in some cases like the Heavy Bolter, this means reducing or eliminating a drawback. There's a damage boost power-up, one for full ammo on everything and then some, one for essentially berserking, granting damage reduction and causing the chainsword to dish out some extra pain, one for a short stint of infinite ammo, some classic big boosts for health and armor, and some very interesting power-ups specifically for the bolter. These are drum magazines that contain a finite amount of specific ammunition that greatly improve the functionality of this weapon in one specific way or another. These power-ups are sometimes scattered around a level or often tucked away in most secrets. Now on to the secrets. I feel like they were made with different difficulties in mind. Some are like dropping an actual Easter egg in the grass for a toddler to find. Some are tucked away pretty good, like here, I'm supposed to jump down here with my newly acquired yellow key, but over there I can find a secret, etc. And some things feel like they should be secrets, Like this moment where I had to chainsword dash my way into a window and there are items in there, but it's not a secret. I didn't go looking for secrets. I don't usually do that much work to find them. Oftentimes in games there'll be a tell that there's a secret, or the designers will show you something that you can't reach in an obvious way, and those secrets I prefer myself. I'm not the type to step away from the flow of the moment-to-moment gameplay to dig around for the cryptic ones. I did, in fact, find about 90% of what Boltgun was hiding on my first playthrough. Now, I'm fine with what they did here. With that being said, though, if you do enjoy poking around a level for the intricate design choices to find all the goodies that were artistically hidden in ways that make you look at or think about something in different ways, well, that's not a common theme here. So, throughout the first episode, you're going to encounter a slowly escalating series of challenges. At first, you'll be moving from point A to B with a pause and a dramatic reveal every time you find a new weapon, surrounded by combat encounters that highlight that weapon's strengths and hide that weapon's weaknesses. In fact, if you don't read through the help page on the main menu, you will learn the weapon's weaknesses the hard way, and that may not be immediately apparent the first time you hit that wall because, thankfully, each weapon is still useful to some degree against each enemy. The first episode pits you mostly against the forces of Tzeentch, the chaos god of sorcery and change. You'll traverse castles, seeing all kinds of medieval architecture, and really indulge in a Castlevania kind of vibe here, visually. I think this episode had my favorite aesthetics, honestly. It will take some time, but the exterior cold snow-capped point A to B maps slowly give way to gothic castle-like structures that offer more intricate map design and a more threatening enemy roster. You can really feel the changes as you go from being an interloper to a straight-up condemning threat, and the game seems to react in line with that. From that perspective, you can almost feel some Quake influence reverberating around these halls somewhere. This traipsing culminates in reaching a chapel and coming face to face with the Lord of Change, a greater demon of Tzeentch. He came prepared for you, and you'll have to quickly prepare for him, and he's not alone. There are some flying enemies that will chase you around the arena and try to keep your attention off of him as he's teleporting and assaulting you with a varied attack pattern. There's a few interesting mechanics here though, as I found out on accident, and I think it only applies to this specific boss fight. Don't worry, you'll see more Lords of Change though, trust me. Killing the flying enemies causes more enemies to spawn in quickly. Being unprepared the first time I got here, I targeted them to get them out of my way, which caused a rush of ads to pile up and pepper me all across the arena and had my attention so split that I actually died after the boss was dead, because in my mind, the fight was ultimately over. It is not. Don't let your guard down just yet, and those minions aren't deterred by the loss of a general. There's no surrender. The second time I focused on the Lord, and the other ads didn't even spawn until he was almost dead. Each subsequent visit from a Lord of Change had me eliminating all the reinforcements before focusing on the Lord. Now this actually isn't the end of the episode. You're actually here to kill the Chaos Sorcerer. To get there, off the back of the arena you just conquered the Lord of Change in, there's another section of castle with a tower to climb. At the top, a dimensional rift, you're gonna have to go through some crazy teleporting maddening MC Escher labyrinth of teleporting all over the place. Seriously, this place is kind of awesome though. It took me a bit too long to realize the pattern, but once it clicked I was pretty satisfied. I'll leave that one for you to figure out too. It's cool. This leads you to the Chaos Sorcerer fucking about in a library, obviously in search of some of that good forbidden knowledge, having physically manifest a ball of warp, just right there, sitting in the middle of this library. He'll put up a good fight before going down, but not like that Lord of Change, nah. He will teleport, but you and him both have a lot more room to maneuver, and that's just way more beneficial to you than it is to him. Now, chasing his teleporting hiding ass across the library eventually leads to the conclusion of the first episode as you have found and assaulted the Chaos Sorcerer, causing him to run away like a little bitch. By this time, you'll actually have encountered most of the enemies in the game. Some more than others, and that's in line with the themes of the episode, so let's talk about the enemies. Now, before we get right into the specific enemy types, we have to talk about their toughness level. This is a number that you'll see next to their health bar, and that can actually seem a bit arbitrary in the long run, but it does have mechanical relevance throughout the entire experience. Each enemy is tagged with a toughness level, and that determines whether or not they take full, extra, or reduced damage from a weapon. It's a simple higher number wins game that has you dealing extra damage if your weapon has a higher strength level than the enemy's toughness, standard damage if it is equal, and reduced damage if it's less. There are fringe cases where, if the gap is wide enough, this damage difference will be magnified greatly. However, for the most part, all of your weapons are always useful for dealing damage. You have smaller enemies like Nurglings that swarm and try to be as annoying as possible, only sometimes offering to attack from range. Cultists, which are mostly fodder but oftentimes are used against you in ways that give them opportunities to try to deal damage from range with various firearms that they may or may not be carrying. Most of the weapons that you can carry can also be carried by a cultist, or a smaller variant of the same thing. The problematic ones are the ones with a plasma gun. It hits hard and has splash damage. The best response to those, honestly, because the projectile is on the slower side, is to chain dash them through it, avoiding damage and purging them in the process. Horrors of the pink and blue variety, the pink ones throw projectiles at you, and if not overkilled, will spawn two of the smaller blue ones when they die, which head straight for you and engage in melee with what's likely the fastest connecting attack in the game. Hitting them with a chain dash will usually one-shot them, and they'll still hit you for doing it. Chaos Marines, which carry bolters and frag grenades, take a little bit of punishing before they fold and never back down. These guys are a great bread and butter enemy, and also a great supply of ammo and grenades, actually. Covering some more of the Chaos Forces, we have the Champions, which carry an axe and a plasma gun. Usually they're charging at you full sprint, and when that's happening, you don't have to worry about that plasma gun. But that axe, though, oof. If they can cause you to bleed, they will be granted a second chance when they die, coming back tougher, faster, and more vicious. Thankfully, it only happens once, but they're the real bastards. Following that up, there are the Terminators. Big, tanky, heavy bolter, and they're not chasing you. They're pinning you down with a hill of lead, and they're not very fast to eliminate either. They're so bulky, though, that you'll have plenty of time to move from cover to cover and fire off a few shots in their direction when they pause to reload. Then we have Tzeentch Screamers. Flying blue asshole demons. Look, all the enemies are memorable, and most of them are great. These guys are great at getting in the way. They fly straight at you unless they're actively being hit by a weapon tougher than they are, and they just fly in your face and chew on it. Blech. Flamers and Exalted Flamers cast a spread of fireballs that are easily avoidable on their own, but are probably the best at locking you down into a spot for a second or two, just to avoid them. This gives other enemies opportunities to take pot shots at you. Bloat drones, heavily armored, slow-moving flying tanks that can't shoot straight, but can spray pestilent fumes and liquids, and they do take a larger amount of time to kill, so if you leave them alone to move on to other targets, that's when they can become dangerous, having been left alone long enough to find advantageous positioning for area denial attacks. And anvils, both large and colossal in sizes, are extremely high damage wrecking balls on legs that charge you, but have a significant wind up and wind down and little ability to change direction. They will hurt you if they can connect, a lot. There are a lot of enemy types, and within that, variations of some of them. It's worth talking about them because they are uniquely constructed and well done. But most of these enemies aren't threatening on their own, but are designed to work in tandem to become mechanically dangerous, because they do, in fact, cover weaknesses left by other enemies. Then there's the bosses. Not a big variety of bosses, but you'll see them more than once. First boss, a Lord of Change, only goes as hard as you do. Found out on accident, kill the ads, get the ads. The boss itself took a break when I hit it enough. Focusing on only the boss turned it real easy. The second boss, the Chaos Sorcerer, had a very limited supply of friends and also kept taking a break. Didn't kill me once and was much easier than the first. After this, the boss encounters tend to escalate in arena coverage, but not quite in a linear pattern. This isn't necessarily a bad thing, as some are just meant to be a hurdle on your way through a level, and some are meant to be a real crescendo of violence. The second episode is owned and operated by Granddaddy Nurgle, the chaos god of pestilence, plague, disease, rot. As such, you'll be tasked with scraping the nasty minions from the putrid sewers like a janitor catching overtime in December. The level structure here evolves, so as to not limit the progression to a straight line per se, but the actual visual decor is, well, it's on point from what you can expect from the areas you're in. It's not the most appealing, but it certainly is on point. The sewers, like I said, some caves, some pretty neat industrial areas, and also a bit of desert. It even opens up in a desert with you stripped of all previously acquired arsenals, spare your trusty bolter and chainsword. This episode, while a sharp left turn from the end of episode 1, with reason at least, is actually more of a solid lead into episode 3, but it will introduce you to a new boss, the Great Unclean One. This is a boss that's either going to be piss easy or annoying and slightly unfair, depending on whether or not you've picked up on that one mechanic. No fear. It will spawn hordes of Nurglings that will rapidly charge the ability when you focus on them, which gives you opportunity after opportunity to stand toe-to-toe with the boss, who otherwise can actually dish out a lot of damage that can be difficult to dodge when engaged in combat. Coming in two forms. There's a horizontal double-tapped wave of damage and an overdose of that spray acid you've encountered before. The thing is, the Great Unclean One doesn't really move very fast or very far. You can disengage anytime. And this is, I believe, how you're supposed to deal with him. Disengage, charge no fear, re-engage. We might as well discuss the weapons now. There's the chainsword, badass little stick with teeth on it and a motor, as previously mentioned a few times now. Has one more thing I want to cover. If you keep hitting the button for using the chainsword dash while you are face to face with an enemy, you will keep revving it up in their face. Sometimes you may find yourself just doing this simply because it's awesome. This is usually where you run into that issue that it's not going to stun lock your target effectively, but it will deal large amounts of damage pretty quickly. The titular bolt gun, or bolter, is the most workhorse of workhorse weapons. It has a standard fully automatic firing mode, coupled with good solid feedback, and it's something you'll enjoy having as that workhorse. It does have those previously mentioned special ammo power-ups too. These single drum mags come in 3 flavors, and when they're empty, you're back to regular ammo. There's Dragonfire rounds, which add splash damage to the point of impact, Kraken rounds that dramatically increase the rate of fire, and Vengeance rounds that penetrate. Period. As in, they penetrate enemies, penetrate walls. You can wallbang guys hiding behind other guys hiding behind cover. You could probably clear a room in the next map if you aimed right. Anyway, then there's the shotgun. It's great for turning cultists into that heresy-flavored mist, and at range it's good for spreading damage around multiple smaller targets. It does tend to fall short on punching through armor without burning ammo, though. We have a plasma cannon, and no, this isn't like the Doom plasma rifle, this is a Warhammer 40k plasma cannon. It does have a similar firing pattern in that it will fire repeatedly as long as you hold the trigger, and has a short cooldown after letting go, but the projectiles differ. They're more like rockets, and at full damage or more on most enemies in the game. A heavy bolter, and this gun is made of yes. It's admittedly not the easiest to use as it slows you down to fire it and has a wind-up time before actually firing, but listen. Damn, I love the way it sounds, and the way it just impacts things you hit. When powered up, this gun actually just doesn't slow you down anymore. Next, having a Vengeance launcher is, well, honestly, this feels like the most shoehorned weapon out of all of them. It's thematic, but it has a small splash damage explosive that does fire out in a straight line, yet has a short window of time before detonating. Don't get me wrong, it can be very accurate at range for those times you just need to snipe a cultist on a ledge, and coming in at 3 strength, the lowest, it does do enough damage to punch up in weight, but all in all, this isn't going to be one we come back to often. The Meltagun, on the other hand, is very on brand. Picture a shotgun and a welder's blowtorch had a baby, right? But a really big one. It does the melting of everything in a cone pattern in front of you. It'll cook a group of enemies, it'll lay heavy damage on bigger enemies, it delivers righteous fury. A Volkite Caliver will give you another option to deal with those champions though. It's a laser, it does laser stuff. You point it at an enemy and hold the trigger and it does high damage pretty fast. Still, if you kill something with this, it'll pop like a piñata. Those champions cannot respawn when their body is 60% stew and 40% confetti. This leaves us with one weapon, the BFG of Boltgun, the Grav Cannon, high damage AoE. Where this one is different is that you kinda have to hold the trigger. It will do the room clearing as long as you hold the trigger and aim it in the general direction of the bad guys. In a lot of ways, the Caliver and the Grav Cannon share that function and also that weakness. Maintaining the trigger means maintaining the line of sight with the people aiming guns at you. You'll be using all of these in the final episode of the game, too. Charging through the hellish backdrop of massive industrial foundries, you'll be reacquiring your weapons one at a time. This is where the game finally asks you if you've understood and learned the weaknesses of the weapons that you've been using this whole time, and honestly, it doesn't slack off here. These are the tightest encounters yet. The challenge has been evolving this whole time. Now, I don't mind too much when a game hits a high note and holds it for entirely too long, but you don't have to deal with that here. There's no stagnation in this stride. You have the most difficult to find secrets, challenging fights, and perilous level design. This is leading you, oh yes, it's still a lead up, it just doesn't feel like it, to a final level that's going to put everything you've learned so far to use simultaneously. I could have existed in this moment longer, but the developers do know what they've given you and what it takes to use it well. It's a simultaneous boss rush and horde survival that's going to have you choosing when to apply what skills and mechanics you have available to you. So when you think about how it feels to be here in Boltgun, the developers are saying right out of the gate that they know why you came here, even down to the intro Doom references. It's visceral, it's weighty yet smooth movement. Changing velocity is met with resistance. Your movement becomes an extension of gameplay, and a very important one. Like when we learned how to circle strafe in Doom, the more you master the movement mechanics, the less likely you are to take damage. Gunplay is comfortable for boomer shooter fans. It does have a few extra wrinkles. The weapons have a strength level, as do the enemies. This is not actually bricking you into using specific weapons, which I appreciate. You can still use low strength weapons on high strength enemies, it's just going to take more DACA. Understanding what each weapon is capable of may also lead you to choose lower strength weapons when it would otherwise seem like a handicap. So how is this all represented to us, the player? Visually, the graphics are somewhere between like late PS1 and late PS2. The kind of stuff you'd see when people were pushing systems to the limit to squeeze as much as they could out of them. This stuff I find charming, but it does lead to wildly different texture resolutions at times. This is actually really common throughout the game, and it can be jarring because it breaks that cohesion the visual aesthetic builds. When assets or textures of differing resolutions are set next to one another, it can instantly break that zone you get into feeling comfortable with the game's art style. But the good news is that the out-of-place, blown-out low-res textures aren't used to wrap something important or high concept. It's going to be a rock, or the broken edge of a walkway or something. In that regard, it does become a lot easier to overlook, even if you are still going to notice it happening. This does make it so much less problematic, but sometimes I just had that what the hell feeling, wondering if there was a miscommunication somewhere in development. To continue this tangent, sometimes you can literally see the seams in the maps. I want to say you'd have to go looking for most of them. I caught one on accident and started picking it up, but these are very infrequent from what I noticed. I know this is rather nitpicky about the visual fidelity, but there's a point to be made here. If this is the negative, then the positive should stack up against it heavily. And they do. There are options for pixelation levels, which is a nice touch. A little bit of customizing to your preference is always a good bit of extension toward the audience you're trying to connect with. Personally, I oftentimes leave these things at a default level for the first playthrough of a game, unless I really find something I just love, because that way I get the developer's intended visual aesthetic. So with that, let's have a look at what we're dealing with. I mean, like you're not already, right? The environments are constructed in a way that's trying to emulate old rudimentary procedures, but has too intricate a detail to just toss on the pile. It's extremely effective in creating a mood in the levels that have a lot going on. On the other hand, places like caves and deserts start to actually give off more of that rudimentary feel. This isn't going to be as intrusive as it sounds though, because both of these styles can be used effectively, and here there's a degree of separation simply through the level design alone. It did have me preferring the more richly detailed areas, but hey, it is on brand thematically. A desert is not as intricate as a castle. There is, in specific areas and for specific reason, a sparsely used parallax and warp effect. Now that is distracting, but it is the point of it, so here we are on both ends of the spectrum, still stacking up. The enemies are all 2D sprites, and that's a soft spot for me. I love good sprite work, but I also feel that there's so many more facets to it than people want to admit. On the surface, you have how they look, including how far they have to turn before another sprite is used to depict another angle. The frames used in animations, all of that. In Boltgun, most of the sprites give you an overt and exaggerated animation depicting exactly what they're doing and have enough angled sprites to give them that perception of three-dimensional space being used. Now I say most, because the animals can be difficult to read sometimes, but I'm willing to say that this may be intentional because every other enemy and even the animals' idle animations have all kinds of extra frames to display the kind of actions they're performing. I mean, really, even down to the fact that if you run directly at a cultist, you'll see them stop firing and hold their gun in the air to signal a bit of a surrender. So what then do I mean by so many more facets? Well, let's think of how weapon feedback is used in shooters. Half of that comes down to the reaction you get from the enemies, at least half. Doom, for instance, had each enemy built with an inherent chance to flinch just for a split second when receiving damage. That flinch would cause their subroutines to restart. In that way, players really got a sense that hitting a monster made them not only feel it, but rethink the way they're approaching the player. They became real enemies and not simply targets to hit. On the other hand, when enemies don't react to being hit as much, it can lead to feeling a sense of weak feedback to the combat because this aspect is missing or undercooked. I feel like this is important more so with 2D sprites because the suspension of disbelief is farther along on the table. Boltgun understands this and opts to try to use both. Some enemies can flinch or slow down for a second, while others won't last long enough for that to ever matter. Other enemies yet will be shrugging off the damage you're dealing while they're charging you down. A lot of this boils down to the strength of the weapon and the toughness of the enemy, as in you'll see glancing shots bounce off of armor if your weapon is too weak. You'll see clouds of red mist if your weapon is overpowered. Enemies will get shredded by your attacks. While it's not perfect, it definitely does work here. The best part is that you will know exactly how effective your weapons are without ever looking at the numbers in a very natural way. Literally ranging from shots barely denting heavily armored foes and only rattling their contents doing minimal damage, all the way up to stopping oncoming combatants dead in their tracks. This is coupled with the absolutely great weapon sprite work, as all the guns are animated really well too. The cutscenes are minimalistically animated and really capture that older game's cinematic presentation. I mean, there's a certain charm to this, but they're very limited as you're only going to see a handful of these. Audio on the weapon feedback is pretty good. Not the absolute best, but not low quality by any stretch of the imagination. The guns are punchy and the chainsword is visceral. All of these things feel good to use, so it's aided by the thick sound effects. Again, something about that heavy bolter is just a sound I love to hear, and I can't think of any one sound effect that stands out as weak. The enemy sound effects are solid too. The go-to thing about sound design of older or retro stylized games is that you can often tell what's either happening or about to happen based on the sounds you can hear. I'm pleased to say that this is the case here. You'll hear a Chaos Terminator spinning up his own heavy bolter to rattle off a lot of lead at you, or you'll hear anvils charging, frogs beginning to puke acid everywhere, marines calling out their next action, and champions, well, sometimes you just won't hear them, and that's the point. They'll deliberately try to be quiet so you're caught off guard as they come shooting out of a crowd to literally break into a sprint directly towards your face with an axe. Those guys tried to be the bane of my existence. This leaves the music. It's there, mostly. It didn't really stick with me at all. There's a bit of ambience that I'm not sure was even trying to be thematic, and there was higher tension music for combat encounters. It wasn't terrible. It just wasn't very memorable. Most of it is either reused or sounds very similar to other tracks used previously. The menu music was fairly decent, actually, and that's unfortunately where it peaks. There are accessibility options to drastically change the way you engage with the game, ranging from invulnerability or having all the weapons available to you, down to disabling some of the more jarring visual elements. It's always a good thing to have more options, and these guys just want to make sure that you're enjoying your time with Boltgun with as few roadblocks as possible. This does translate a little too much into the difficulty. Talking about difficulty is always subjective. I can say that there are actually a multitude of ways to engage each combat scenario. You're not locked into any one method of dealing with any particular threat, and I appreciate that. But Boltgun isn't here to beat your ass either. It's decent on its highest difficulty, Exterminatus. Very forgiving of the player making mistakes, though. It could use one or two more higher difficulties that require mastery of the controls and a deep understanding of how the weapons and enemies work. I feel like there are three camps to what people want out of difficulty. There's comfortable, which is something that most people can at least enjoy casually, being able to succeed in something based on pre-existing skill or working toward a goal. There's painful, which is the kind of thing that isn't enjoyed simply for performing the tasks, but rewarding for overcoming the obstacles laid before you. I think that I live there. Sometimes I try to live there. And then there's casual, for people who want creativity or enjoying something for the sake of accomplishing it as it is, or, the party games you dig out once in a while. Gameplay in Boltgun is just comfortable. It's not too difficult on easier difficulties for people joining the boomer shooter genre to find a footing. Maybe you're here because you're a Warhammer 40k fan, without all that much shooter experience. But I feel like we have room for more pain on the highest difficulty. It's satisfying, but it's comfort food for veterans of the genre in that regard, as it does leave quite a bit of room for error. It took me until the very last combat encounter to put all of the mechanics of the game together in a symphony of bloodshed that really tested my mettle. So, at the end of the day, how does it flow? What is the flow state of Boltgun? Well, you're a walking death machine sliding into and out of danger, laughing maniacally in the face of death as you turn him right around and give him a solid shove toward the heretics that are more or less blocking your path. You're burying your chainsword 3 feet deep in a 1 foot wide skull as you crank up your Volkite caliber to deliver searing fury to the next Chaos Terminator before he can unload on you. You feel the hatred for the heretic grow as your arsenal of weapon and skill alike grow to match the increasing resistance. Resistance that feeds the machine. The more that stands in your way, the more fulfilling the slaughter. You become the bouncing, sliding, bullet-dodging, skull-breaking, heretic-burning, demon-punishing machine that is Malam Kaido. The Emperor behind you, righteous fury in front of you, become unstoppable power. The flow state is a cathartic power trip, and it's thematically on brand. That's how it feels to play Boltgun. So, at the end of the day, I played a game and enjoyed it, and I wanted to rattle on about it. You're here at the end of the video, so thank you for letting me rattle on about it, and I'll probably do it again in the future. In fact, I think I even know what I want to do next.